You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your handing out host, Abraham.
And I'm your freebie host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do and why they do those things, and like animals and policies. And sometimes we talk about hypotheses, I guess, that maybe are good ideas or maybe not.
Yeah, kind of like possible human behavior that could work or could not work depending on a lot of different variables. It's the idea of what could be.
Yeah.
And I think that's fun too. What we could do and what we could be.
Yeah, what we might do. Why we might do what we might do.
Yep, there you go.
We needed more syllables in the name, so we finally accomplished it.
Yeah, we wanted to make our website really hard to get to.
Exactly. So anyway, thank you for joining us. If you are with us for the first time, hey, thanks for being here. We appreciate you. Mm-hmm. And if you like what you hear today, you can support us in a variety of ways. You can pick up some merch. You can leave us a rating and a review. You can subscribe. You can head over to our Patreon and join our group of awesome humans there who help keep us going. And if you do that, you get all sorts of bonus content. But if you are not new to us, or even if you are, it doesn't really matter. We're going to wish you a happy Amelia Earhart Day this day, July 24th.
Yes, and we are also going to celebrate with you Cousin's Day.
Yeah, the George R. R. Martin is big on Cousin's Day.
That's what I understand. I've never read it, but I understand it.
Also Siblings Day.
Yeah.
It is International Self-Care Day. This one is important, and I fully endorse it.
Yes, love that. It is National Drive-Thru Day, which is fun, whether it's a movie or fast food or a liquor store. Those all exist.
Yeah, that is a fact. Best accompanied by Weird Al's Trapped in the Drive-Thru song.
Oh man, I forgot all about that. What a great tune. That is so fun.
It's really good. It is also National Tequila Day. Speaking of drive-thrus.
Yeah. Don't celebrate those two things together.
Right.
It's National Thermal Engineers Day, which is a lot of fun.
All right, so we got Amelia Earhart, Cousins, Self-Care, Drive-Thru, Tequila, and Thermal Engineers. It is National Talk to Us Day, and the idea behind this one is advocating that people share their thoughts and feelings, that they open up to one another, they express themselves honestly. Some people maybe should button that stuff up, but some of us, we should share.
Agreed. It is Pioneer Day, which is a state holiday in Utah.
Oh, I see.
We have a pioneer settlement here down the road from us, and that's where I learned how to make candles.
No, fair enough. Yeah. I guess rather than I see, I should have said O-U-T or just U-T.
Yeah. That makes sense. I like that.
It is Tell an Old Joke Day, which I think I just did, maybe. Maybe I just told it was a new joke, but it sounded like an old joke. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt old. I mean, you had to do Pioneers and Utah, so that felt old. That's fine.
Yeah. The subject matter was old.
Uh-huh. It's National Independent Retailers Week.
Okay. It is also National Moth Week, not for eating, just for appreciating.
Yes, and not to be confused with National Mothman Week, which is very different experience. It's also National Scrabble Week, so get your words out.
And National Zookeeper Week, those people who keep the zoos.
Yes. Those who possess the zoos. It's also Restless Leg Syndrome Education and Awareness Week. Everything I know about Restless Leg Syndrome comes from commercials in the 90s.
I actually think that we either did an episode on this or talked about doing an episode on this. I think we just talked about it. I don't think we've done it yet. But it's an interesting one that would be worth unpacking, at least for a mini, if not a full-length discussion, I think.
Yeah, be on the lookout for our episode on Restless Leg Syndrome, folks.
Well, let's get to our subject at hand, because although talking about holidays and recognizing them is fun and playfully whimsical, I guess. Mm-hmm. We are actually talk about psychology things. We are talk about psychology things. I think what I meant to say is we do talk about psychology things.
Yes.
And so we will do that now. As I sort of discovered in a previous discussion of ours, it seems that we may be more historically oriented of a podcast than we initially thought that we were. And so let's talk about history a little bit, because that's going to make up a huge chunk of our discussion today. It feels like our modern memory anymore is pretty short. We're like, yesterday, what was that? And so a few years ago is basically ancient history, but a few years ago, something was going on, which was that there was yet another election, because those happen a lot. And at the time, this was for the presidential election. Politicians were vying for the nomination for the Democratic candidate to challenge the then incumbent president, Donald Trump. Okay. And one specific candidate made a bold part of his platform this idea that he called, well, I'll let him explain it actually.
My flagship proposal is a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for every American adult starting at age 18. So that means that you would receive $1,000 a month every month.
As you heard in that clip, this was Andrew Yang, the candidate, and he was sort of rebranding this idea that had existed already called universal basic income as a freedom dividend. But yeah, it was this idea of $1,000 a month.
Yeah, and so we have to ask the question of, is this madness? Is this genius? Or is this some well-intentioned but misguided hypothesis? Or some legitimately effective strategy to improve people's lives and the economy? I mean, to be fair, if I got an extra $1,000 a month, that would be pretty rad. So
yes, definitely many people would hear this and say, sure,
nice.
If you're offering, I will take it. So let's talk about this universal basic income idea. It goes by several names, but through much of this discussion, you'll hear us call it UBI, which is how it's frequently referred to by economists and other people who sort of are in the sphere of discussion around this. We'll talk about the historical precedent for the idea of this universal basic income and the evidence that there is sort of for or against it, as well as just the arguments that people have made. And then I think a really important aspect is how likely is this to actually affect change? Will it affect people's behavior, the economy? What will it do? How does it do that thing? And so that I think is sort of our goal in this discussion, is to understand the role that the policy of universal basic income or something like it would play.
Absolutely. So universal basic income, also called basic income guarantee, social dividend, national dividend, or freedom dividend, according to Andrew Yang, is the idea that all individuals who qualify will receive a no strings attached, regularly scheduled payment. It is really technically just could be any amount of money, but the idea most commonly floated around in modern discussions is $1,000 per month, as described by Yang.
Yeah, that's sort of a very common number that you'll see. I saw much lower than that. I saw much higher than that. But most people in discussions around this in more contemporary, I guess, calculations really were landing on about $1,000 a month as the primary goal. Although we'll see that in some of the instances where versions of this have been applied, it has been more or less and has been implemented in different ways.
Right.
But that's sort of the idea. And this is an ongoing forever thing. This isn't like for a year you get this. The idea is that from now until you are dead, you are eligible to receive every month at the beginning of the month $1,000 to do with as you will. It is just a cash infusion straight into your hands or into your bank account.
Right.
You are not told how to spend it. It is not restricted to certain items. It is just, here's $1,000, go nuts.
Right.
Or, pay your bills as it turns out.
Right.
So the general practice has been around likely as long as people have lived in communal groups. At least this idea of there being like unrestricted access to resources that is freely given. In these sort of small nomadic tribes that humans would have lived in a long time ago, everyone had a role to play, and that role was not always procuring food.
Right.
Nevertheless, everyone in the tribe was granted unrestricted access to that food when it was obtained by the people whose role it was to get it. There were many times children who were too young to really contribute meaningfully. They were very small. They probably could barely walk. They were not going to be doing very much in the way of contributing to that tribe. They would eventually, but when they're very small, they wouldn't. And then you have older people who manage to make it to old age who were too weak, too feeble, or too sickly to help. And the policy was not, well, they can't help, throw them in a ditch. It was, we're going to take care of them.
Right.
And so there was just the society carried the burden in these groups while they could of maintaining the people in the society who couldn't. And that was just an understood phenomenon of living in a communal group, as not everybody can participate in the same way. And so the people who were not too old or preventing from taking part in this would contribute to the best that they could. And then the people who couldn't contribute still had access to that. They were not prevented from accessing their, the share of the resources that were made available to the entire group.
Right. Capitalism was not always the thing that ran societies. And you'll see that kind of as we go, like it is one of those things where historically people have taken care of each other. And so the idea of giving back to folks that are part of the group is super important. So now more modernly in Athens, not Athens, Georgia, Athens, Greece. Athens, Georgia is a very different place.
Athenians.
Yeah. Very different group of people. A small portion of money generated by the mines was freely distributed to citizens, or what could be described as non-enslaved elite males. So that's who got the money. Not everybody, but the ones that they considered were the most important, which were non-enslaved and elite and men.
Yeah, the ones who were technically citizens were the not enslaved elite males who then had access to this this version of it. But it was like a universal basic income in that they didn't have to do anything to earn that. It was revenue that was simply generated by activity. And so they just received that as citizens.
Right.
In the 1790s, this became more of a sort of conceptual idea that was written about by some people who were influential. One that maybe some people have heard of is Thomas Paine. He essentially argued that what had happened with private land ownership is that by specifically owning this land, people were then prevented from being able to support themselves. Because if they didn't own the land, then they didn't own the rights to hunt, fish, grow agriculture, or otherwise use the resources of the land to do whatever they would do to live, because it had been doled out as private property to somebody. And oftentimes there would be someone who owned that who then collected some kind of rent or mortgage or whatever. And, because these people couldn't use their land themselves, Thomas Paine argued that the rents that were generated from these privately owned lands should therefore be redistributed to citizens as basically a stakeholder grant. Like they would work the land more or less, and so they would just receive a general income that would give them additional money to support themselves because they couldn't otherwise support themselves because of private ownership.
Right. And so shortly afterward, Thomas Spence really expanded this idea into the idea of a full-fledged UBI by suggesting that everyone receive unconditional cash payouts from the revenue generated by taxes. So it kind of really quickly became a thing that people, or at least people kind of hypothesized and generated as like a possible economic strategy.
Yeah, I think that Thomas Spence might be the first like comprehensive version of a universal basic income in a capitalistic society arrangement.
Right.
Like I said, versions of this had existed before, but where there was functionally capitalism, this seems to be the first fully comprehensive idea put forth here. And this is, again, before the 1800s. Now, in 1848, a Belgian socialist author named Joseph Charlier, or maybe Joseph Charlier, I'm just going to butcher it, again sort of reinvented and repackaged this idea, suggesting that the proceeds generated by rent be redistributed evenly as a universal basic income. And this sort of kicked off a sort of reimagining and revitalization of this idea by economists and policymakers who really began to seriously consider a universal basic income to try and address the fallout of capitalism, which was extreme poverty. We had a lot of disease, death, homelessness, and poverty in these governments and these systems. And so in an attempt to try and assuage that, they were trying to imagine what could do the trick. And this was one of the solutions that they sort of came up with by repackaging this idea.
Right. And so as we continue along this timeline, I think this idea of UBI I think it's really fascinating. I'm so excited to get more into it. In 2024, we don't have UBI. What we have instead are ads, and that's what generates revenue and does not get redistributed. So, I mean, as far as like the content goes, everybody gets ads, but not everybody gets paid. So, continuing with that theme, here's an ad for everybody. Nobody gets paid.
Okay, so universal basic punishment. That's what ads seem to be.
Universal basic ads.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back to this whole policy here, this idea of a universal basic income. Now, although this is largely seen as sort of a progressive policy, the idea has been generally embraced from both left and right-wing politicians. Now, I'm gonna mostly list some just from the United States, but this actually has spanned other governments and other countries as well, again, across both versions of sort of liberal and conservative ideology. So let's take, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., who said, quote, "The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income," end quote. And as you'll recall, another name for the idea of the universal basic income was a guaranteed income, or a basic income guarantee is another one with the acronym BIG, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, and then similarly, an economic advisor to Ronald Reagan, of all people, wrote of a guaranteed income, said, quote, "It would provide an assured minimum to all persons in need, regardless of the reasons for their need." Even Richard Nixon said, quote, "I propose that we abolish the welfare system and that a basic federal minimum would be provided," end quote. So, like, it sounds like there are people who have like a general idea of what this might look like and how this might apply, while they're trying to also abolish other systems. But like having that conversation around, this is something that we could do that might be helpful.
Yes. And so I think, people might hear this idea of the universal basic income and think, isn't this what welfare already is? And I think that's a legitimate question. Like, isn't that just welfare? Like, aren't they describing welfare? It does have some things in common with welfare, but it is very different in some important ways. One is that welfare actually has a lot of conditions applied to who earns it and how much they can earn. It has complicated, overlapping, and sometimes contradictory requirements, sometimes including work, sometimes not, that differ by state and may only be granted if and to a certain extent based on what you contributed to the welfare system through previous work or previous work history, as well as, in a lot of ways, actually discourages work, because if it's dependent on, for example, a certain level of income, people who might exceed the threshold for income by working then no longer qualify for welfare, but also still don't have enough money to pay their bills and so instead what they'll do is not work, even though they would prefer to work. And then that's the only way they continue to qualify for the welfare, or they might again be required to work. But another thing that happens is that welfare specifies how the money can be received and spent. So right. The money is only available for specific food, specific housing, specific medication. It's like directly guided by the state or the government in terms of what that money goes to and how it's used. And so instead, with the UBI system just has none of that is part of it.
Right. So the UBI system is streamlined. It's simple, and it actually might, and a lot of people actually see it as a fairer system. So in the UBI system, people who receive an income can still choose to work, and in fact, doing so allows them to greatly increase their income. So not only do they get to continue to work, but they have this extra cushion that exists underneath this type of program.
This might feel a little bit like a non sequitur, but it reminds me of a story that's a personal story I have of. I remember once talking to someone who expressed frustration at people who were sort of panhandling. The people you see on corners with signs asking for some change or some money or something. And they said something to the effect of, why don't they just get a job? And of course, to me, this is really silly, because that specifically means you have to then think, why don't they just get a job, means that the people who are on the street asking for money find it easier, faster, and more lucrative to get money that way than to get a job. Like that would be the implication of that.
Right.
They could get a job, instead they choose to panhandle because that's easier, faster, and more lucrative. No, it is not those things.
Right.
The problem is people are always, often, but so often that it's basically always required to have an address to get a job. So if these are people who are unhoused, they often can, always, they can't get a job if they don't have an address, and they can't get an address if they don't have a job. So it becomes this cycle where it's like they can't work even if they want to, because no one will hire them because they don't have an address, which they can't get because no one will hire them. And so they're kind of stuck, what in these situations, what are they supposed to do? They can't do anything. And so it's just a silly, piece of logic just to even ask the question, why don't they get a job? Because they can't, like they would if they could.
Right, exactly. And just for our folks that listen to Australia, if you're not sure what panhandling is, what we're talking about is humbugging. It's called humbugging on that side of the world.
Oh, okay.
Basically just asking for change on the street. And not like busking, which is performing for change on the street. And
not like advocating, be like, hey, we need to change our behavior, everybody. Climate change is a problem. Not like asking for that kind of change.
No, not that kind of change. Not like, change the world. It's like, give me quarters. Now, a UBI system means that people can choose how they spend their money in a way that they feel benefits them the most, or save it, or pay their bills, or do whatever. It is, again, no strings attached, no requirements. Here is money. Do with this money what you will. And this is often appealing to many conservatives because, as it's proposed, it is fair to everyone. Everyone gets the same thing. It is simpler, and in most cases, replaces the current welfare system. So a lot of folks that are kind of more conservative, right-leaning, tend to like it because it's equal across the board.
Yeah, and essentially, that was kind of Andrew Yang's thing as well, is like this would be a replacement. And that really is an important consideration if you're thinking about this. And I imagine many people who are listening to this are asking the question, how would the government pay for this? How would they come up with the money? Because the back of the envelope calculation is that if we were to give all of the citizens of the United States $12,000 a year, this is the $1,000 a month that comes out to $12,000 a year. This would cost the U.S. government over $3 trillion. Trillion with a T. Trillion.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. The strategy then to cover the cost is primarily to abolish the current systems that this would kind of replace. That means that in the sort of most conservative way of looking at this, no more welfare, no more Social Security, no more retirement, no more government funded medicine. Like all those programs, or at least many or most of those programs, are completely axed.
Right.
Now, the problem here is that even axing all of those still would not cover that amount of expense. We're not spending that much of the government's money on those services. So there would also likely need to be some kind of restructuring of taxes that would close some of the tax loopholes. It would force the wealthiest people to pay a lot more or pay anything at all.
Yeah.
And potentially also could increase the deficit by forcing the government to borrow more money to pay for this program. So as an example of what that could look like, there was this UBI experiment in Finland, and had they continued that experiment or been able to continue that experiment, it would have increased the national debt by 5% or more to continue doing it. So if you imagine in the United States with a debt of $1.7 trillion in 2023, 5% of $1.7 trillion is a mega load amount of money.
Yeah,
right?
It's too much. It's
a lot. The overall reduction in cost that a universal basic income would incur, though, is not just in terms of dollars and cents, but also like it would essentially eliminate the deep, complex bureaucracy that has the potential to be a substantial savings because of what's not being spent on that bureaucracy in a UBI system.
And on top of that, as we continue to expand the automation that technology brings to jobs, there are an increasing number of labor hours that will be streamlined and available to be performed by robots and AI. And on one hand, this might make it so that people have more free time and spend their time doing things that they're interested in or supporting themselves, but they will still need to buy food and pay bills. So how do we square that? Well, Perhaps we tax the people who are making all of the money from jobs that are now populated by robots and redistribute their gargantuan profits by using a UBI type of system so that people don't necessarily need to worry if they can't find high-paying jobs. They can work fewer hours at jobs and don't need to pay as much, but get along just fine. And this might even help those companies because they can then afford the higher taxes by having lower salary expenses. So in that space, we're talking about the money is all there. It does exist. It's just a matter of reallocating how it's used.
Yeah, exactly. The proposal basically is shift things around so that they're better. Like,
right.
It's like we have the resources we need. They're just misallocated is sort of the argument that's being made here.
Right.
Okay. So what you might hear in this, and what I feel like we've more or less attempted to communicate, is that everyone's on board with this idea. Republicans like it, Democrats like it, conservatives and liberals all like it, the poor people like it, the wealthy people like it. Everybody's happy here for the most part. So why isn't this a thing? It's rare that we get any kind of universal agreement on anything at all, let alone something gigantic like this. What is standing in the way? So let's spend a little time, and I'll go ahead and say now, the amount of discussion we have on this is so massive that we're pretty much going to have to turn this into a 2-part episode. So I think what we'll do for this next part is we'll unpack the arguments for and against, and this is not the evidence, but the arguments people have made for and against a UBI system, and we'll probably have to close it out there and then come back next time and actually dig into the actual evidence and some more of the sort of underlying theory, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, and so you asked the question of what's standing in the way of UBI. I think one of the things is ads.
Okay, let's go ahead and get to essentially the objections that people do have to the universal basic income system. And I want to preface this by ensuring that I point out these are not our objections on the podcast. These are we are communicating what others have raised as objections about this. Okay.
Yes.
First of all, if it is truly universal, in that system, that means that all adults are eligible. And in some cases, in some proposals, children receive a smaller amount, but they do some, or the family receives some on their behalf as well. Then the argument is that this would be wasted on the people who are already wealthy, who don't need any additional supplemental income. Like they already have plenty. Why give them more?
Sure. Another argument against it is that it wouldn't be fair to grant this type of income to illegal immigrants who weren't paying into the system but benefiting from it. God, I've heard that argument so many times about so many things anyway. Like, it's just absurd.
Yeah, we have some rebuttals to these.
Yes.
Another argument here is that in a universal basic income policy that affects everyone, right, that this can be used by companies to further justify not paying their employees a living wage. If the burden of income is shifted to the government, then people who can afford to be paid less can actually outcompete other people for the same jobs by offering their own labor and their time at a lower wage. And that can make it more difficult for people who might have greater expenses or other reasons beyond their control, such as medical complications or sudden unpredictable things that happen, like car accidents or fires or what have you, or like a sudden death in the family of someone who was a major contributor financially. Those people might need those wages more, but other people are sort of undercutting their job by accepting lower wages on their behalf because those companies don't need to pay as much because they know that everyone's receiving this guaranteed income.
Right. This could also be used to justify charging more for certain services and rent because the expectation is that anyone would have sufficient income to cover their expenses, and everyone charging them will want a piece of that universal basic pie, or the UBP, as we're going to call it.
Yes. Yeah, basically the idea that like people are like, well, why can't you pay rent? I know you receive this universal basic income. So like, I'm going to raise the rent and I know that you should be able to cover it because you are making so much this way.
Right.
All right. Another one is that the universal basic income would essentially have to be paid for by, among other things, by poor people, right? That they would be people who contribute into the system as well, because this would be collected by taxes and other things. Taxes not only paid like income tax, but also as you're buying goods, you're paying taxes on those goods. And so the people who are the worst off are still paying into the system, which they are receiving money, but like they had to pay that money in the first place. So it doesn't really do anything, is the idea here. So according to an economic analyst, Robert Greenstein, this would redistribute wealth up and would actually create greater disparity in wealth allocation rather than alleviating this disparity, because the people who need it the least are still getting it. The people who need it the most are still paying into it. And the people who don't need it at all are also still receiving it. And so it sort of forces the overall distribution up toward people who need it less and would create a bigger gap, is his argument.
Right. Another argument against UBI is that UBI doesn't cure addiction, poor health, lack of skills, or other factors that are relevant for understanding why poverty might exist in the first place. Now, as far as the addiction stuff goes, we did do a whole suite on that, and when we kind of talk about how complex that is in itself. And I would make the argument real quick, and I got to say it because it's just like, this is one of the things that drives me nuts. They're entirely different problems.
That's true.
Like, I think it's really important when we talk about financial problems versus addiction versus poor health versus lack of skills and those factors. They are, they play a role. They interlock with one another, but they are different problems.
It is worth understanding, as we talked about in the series, like it is a multifaceted issue. I mean, but I guess to the point that they're making here, because it's multifaceted, a universal basic income is unlikely to change those reasons.
Right.
But yeah, people with money get addicted too.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Another argument against this idea is that if the universal basic income was high enough to ensure sort of comfortable and sustainable living conditions, then this would really de-incentivize people working because they could easily live without working. They wouldn't go to jobs. They'd try and spend money on things, but they wouldn't necessarily need to work. So the argument is essentially, if you pay people for nothing, you get nothing. That's sort of the catchy, quippy way of talking about what effect this could have on people's working and overall contribution to the growth of the economy.
Yeah, which I feel like is silly because I would work even if I had a steady paycheck outside of that. Like if I were independently wealthy, I'd still work. But that's just my own. That's me. The last objection they make is that making this contingent per person would incentivize greatly expanding family sizes to maximize potential household income. So if everybody's getting paid, then we need more people to get paid.
If everyone's getting paid, everyone's getting laid so that they can get paid more.
Yep, that's an argument apparently.
Okay, so that sort of rounds out the list of reasons that people have sort of argued against this idea of a universal basic income. So there's a lot of arguments for it, and we're going to largely structure these as rebuttals, at least at first. There are more arguments for than there are need for rebuttals, but we'll at least structure it at first as rebuttals for the first one. So the first one here was this idea of wealthy people receiving it who don't need it. Well, the thing is that to restructure taxes to pay for this, the amount that wealthy people would pay into taxes to fund this program would be far greater than the money that they receive from the program. So it really would not be making any additional money or wouldn't be adding a lot to them.
Right.
They'd just be getting a small amount back. So sort of similar to the like 5 or 10 cents we might get for bringing our own bags to the grocery store or bringing our own mugs to coffee shops. It's nice, but like hardly makes a dent in the $6 plain black coffee that we just bought,
Sure. The argument that this would be unfairly granted to illegal immigrants is, like most of these arguments, complete nonsense. You have to sign up for the program to receive income. You can't sign up if you're not a citizen. You aren't a citizen if you are undocumented or here illegally. So the rebuttal to that is, duh, but it wouldn't work.
Yeah, that's just a nonsense argument. Like, how would you get this if you weren't a citizen? You have to enroll in it. Like, they're not just there's not like a dispensary machine. You go up and press a button and you get $1,000, right? Like, you have to be enrolled in the program, which means that they have to know who you are and where you fit in society. So people who were here illegally wouldn't have access to it. So it's just silly.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Some economists have calculated that just $1,000 per adult and $300 per child would virtually eliminate poverty and would significantly reduce homelessness. Whew. So essentially, one argument here is that we could get rid of homelessness with a program such as this one.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty good argument for it. It is unlikely that minimum wages would be abandoned, so people would still be guaranteed whatever income they can get from their jobs, but it would be safe against sluggish growth, low wages, inconsistent work, and the volatility of the gig economy. Further, it would allow people to wait to take jobs until there were better jobs, and we saw this with COVID relief, and they wouldn't be forced to take a job just because it was available, forcing employers to compete for labor by offering better jobs, better pay, better benefits, or any combination of those things. So essentially, the minimum wage thing is going to exist, but employers are still going to have to compete for having good employees.
Yeah, essentially the argument initially was, well, then they could justify not paying people, and then the sort of rebuttal is those people could choose not to take those jobs because they don't have to. Like, they could either find better jobs or wait till a better job comes along, or wait until those companies change their policies so that they pay better.
Right.
Okay, so there was the argument that this would essentially allow people to sort of charge whatever, right? In effect, the hypothesis is that it would drive inflation. But I think the rebuttal is that allowing the economy to remain a free market, at least to the extent that it is a free market, would mean that if prices were to get too out of control, then other companies could basically easily swoop in and outcompete those high prices, and then people would go to those services instead. And that would force those other companies to maintain lower prices, so that essentially the idea here is that people could choose not to engage those markets, and that those companies would then be forced to maintain the lower prices rather than jacking them up. Now,
right.
Of course, this can be circumvented in some grossly nefarious ways, that companies will do price fixing and all of that, but that is another discussion. We actually talked about this a little bit a long time ago when we talked about the funeral industry, and specifically in coffins.
Yeah.
How there'd been some price fixing going on there. But we should revisit that at some point in the future.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about coffins again. Another argument for is that the UBI would be, for all intents and purposes, funded by taxes in one way or another. People who make the least, own the least, and consume the least would pay the least amount of taxes. Thus, although they pay into the system, they get much more back than what they put in. As wages, private ownership, and consumption size increases, so too do their contribution to the system, and the less they quote unquote make from the UBI. 3 models created by researchers at the Roosevelt Institute found that in all scenarios of UBI, increased employment, wages, output, and prices would actually grow the economy.
Yeah. Another one here is that there's this discussion about addiction and medical problems, and like, okay, yes, UBI will not cure the problems that people have. What it might do is, for some people, is it does mean that the reasons that people might use drugs might decrease a little bit. Those situations where people are stressed, they're in poor neighborhoods, that sort of thing. If they have more general support and are better able to seek and successfully complete addiction programs, then although it might not address it directly, it might help alleviate some of the factors that contribute to addiction and maintain addiction in the first place, or at least can help contribute to remediation of that situation once it has arisen. Further, people who have health problems could better afford medical bills to treat their problems so that those problems are less debilitating, making it so that they can more easily participate in society, such as maintaining a job, caring for others, volunteering, etc. And then, of course, there are actually specific examples of this and the evidence that we'll talk about, that when people receive a universal basic income, the people who have the least amount of money could actually then commit to things like college. They can complete their college degrees or go to trade schools, which means that when they are in the situation where they don't have very much money and they also don't have very many skills that make them a valuable labor market asset, they can overcome that lack of skills by receiving training, the training that they would need to then be competitive in the labor market and allow them to be successful. And that would be because they could afford to successfully attend those training programs without necessarily needing to have a full-time job the entire time that they're there.
The thing that I always hear in that argument is that money doesn't buy happiness. And sure, it does. Money does not buy happiness. You cannot buy something that's intangible, period. But like at least as far as an emotion goes. But I would say that, and I've heard the argument is like, it doesn't buy happiness, but it does make life easier.
Yeah.
Right. So like,
that seems to be the moral here.
Yeah. Removing a financial stress makes things a little bit better for people. So like, why wouldn't we do that? So another argument is that the models that demonstrate that UBI is too expensive, because that's a big thing, a UBI is too expensive, and that people won't work, actually put the UBI at a much higher than any legitimate proposal in any way. So the suggestions specifically indicate the amount provided by UBI would be insufficient to fully cover bills, rent, and any other expenses that people have. They would need to work to actually have sufficient income to manage their expenses, and the UBI in every version of its imagining is intended to provide a support, not replace wages from working. So I think it's really important to kind of pinpoint this, is that every single time they've run the model for UBI, it is not as a replacement for work. It is not to say, hey, you don't have to work anymore. It is, hey, you've got a little bit of a wiggle room here, and here's additional support to kind of take the financial burden and stress off of you, at least enough so that you can focus on the things that you need to focus on.
Yeah, essentially, the people who were arguing against this, that it would de-incentivize work and would cost too much, were kind of making a straw man argument by pitching a UBI that was more than what the actual proposals entailed.
Right.
Most of them maxed out at $1,000 a month, whereas some of the models that said this wouldn't work were actually putting it at $2,000 a month or higher. So they're doubling it or more. And the $1,000 was a maximum. And so they were sort of saying, well, we're going to give them so much money that they have no incentive to work. Then I would say, yeah, that probably is what the outcome would be of that program. So
right. But
that's not the proposal that we're making, or that I guess we're not the ones making it. That the people who are pushing for universal basic income are making.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So this argument here that people are basically going to just have as many kids as possible to maximize their income. Let's first of all accept and consider that kids are extremely expensive. Shane, can you verify this?
I can verify twice at least.
Okay, great. Kids are expensive. Citation achieved. Citation, Shane. You got to consider that, like, they'll have these kids and they'll have then 18 years of those kids earning nothing, or in some of these models, they had them earning up to the family earning up to $300 a month per kid. $300 a month, nice, hardly puts a dent in the cost of actually supporting children. Like how much it costs to feed, clothe, diaper, keep them alive, all that sort of stuff. It is more expensive to have a lot more children than it would be even remotely reasonable to have that covered by UBI. It would help soften the blow for those people who don't make very much and would like to have a family. So like they could afford it more, but it would not be a money-making scheme. It would not be a lucrative strategy to like have more kids to get an extra $300 a month when the cost of children is exponentially more than that.
Yeah, so let's consider that for a second. $300 a month in Florida, the average monthly childcare, just to have like a daycare type of program or something like that, is $700 a month on average. So having more kids and still getting $300 a month just adds an extra $400 per child to your bill every month. Like that's not including food, diapers, anything else that comes along with childcare, clothing, any of that stuff, right?
Medical attention until they hurt themselves.
Medical attention. It is
crazy
absurd. Yeah, exactly. It is absurd to think that having kids is a money making scheme. Like that the fact that people think that, it blows my mind. Having kids is a money making scheme. Good Lord. Yeah, and plus, just the stress. Just the stress alone is not worth $300 a month. I love my kids. Just to be clear. There is some additional things, too, that go along with like race and gender inequality. So UBI actually reduces gender and race inequality in pay because everybody makes the same amount and has a say in how they share and how their money is used specifically, right? So it enables and even empowers people in bad living situations to escape those situations because they would at least have some amount of money to support themselves and not be dependent on an abusive partner. So they have independent access to money that they can use to help themselves in a situation that they wouldn't have in a current situation.
We'll talk more about some of that when we get to some of the actual evidence that has been collected in places where they've tried versions of this.
Right.
Another, I think, talking point that people have made is that if you look, versions of a universal basic income exist in sort of small pockets of at least the United States, arguably in many countries. I think in this first example I'm going to get to here, in most, if not all countries, the children of extremely wealthy families already sort of experience their own little microcosm of a universal basic income, because they often have access to, sometimes unrestricted, but even if it's restricted, they'll still have access to large sums of money that they did not earn.
Right.
That they then get to use as they please. They are essentially have a credit card or a cash influx, infusion, whatever it is, that they can kind of do with as they please. And many of them go on to run their family's company or start their own company or invest their money or whatever, but whatever tends to happen, they do tend to, in most cases, maintain comfortable, successful lives.
Right.
So if UBI is working for them, wouldn't we expect it also to work for people who are in desperate situations and in more need of support?
Makes sense, right? And then finally, the last argument for it is that retirement is essentially a universal basic income. Many retired people continue to work or will volunteer or just spend time and money participating in society and contributing to the economy. We have already granted that people of a certain age may stop working, but be guaranteed money and have seen positive effects from that exact type of program. Granted, many of them have saved that money themselves, but then they still later get that money without being directly earned as part of their daily activities. So there is kind of it does exist in some way for certain age groups.
Right. So those are essentially the arguments for and against. I think we maybe missed some ads. I mean, we didn't miss them, but we didn't specifically make space for them.
Nobody really misses them.
Yeah, so I guess we'll specifically make space for them. And then this is our basic income. Again, 5 cents, 10 cents back, whatever. Here it is. All right, so I think that's a good place to sort of cap off this conversation, because we still have a lot to unpack in talking about the specific evidence, the examples where this has actually been applied, where people have used this, as well as I think some caveats to those examples that we'll talk about, and also just generally talking about how we understand and what we think about with behavior, psychology,
right?
What happens in these spaces. So I do want to leave with that we're not specifically advocating anything. We'll get to our conclusions when we finish talking about sort of what the evidence is, but we did want to sort of say, I think at the very least, without committing to a particular position, I feel okay saying that this is an interesting idea. I am curious about it. I would like to know more. I don't know. I think it's at least a cool thought experiment.
Right.
But we'll be able to unpack it more once we have some evidence to speak to.
And I think that's reasonable. I am not an economist. I've got some friends who are, and I don't understand them. But I will say that so far, the arguments for this make more value sense to me than the arguments against this.
It does seem compelling.
That's where I would say right now is like, I tend to, with the information that I've got right now, I would tend to lean for versus against based on what I've seen. But we've got another episode and my mind may change.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is the idea here, is that we want to essentially weigh our understanding of this as thoughtfully as we can and approach it with a nuanced position, not just everything needs to be one extreme or the other. Most of us fall in the middle somewhere. And I think this will be maybe one of those. Maybe we'll completely agree. Maybe we'll completely disagree. Right now, we have some basic arguments and rebuttals for those arguments for and against. And as I said, we'll get into some evidence next time. But I think that we will go ahead and pause this conversation here. Join us next week, where we will pick up on this discussion and further elaborate what there is to know about universal basic income. Before we close up this episode, I would like to first say, if you have stuck with us this whole time, thank you for being here. We do appreciate it. If you liked what you heard here today, you would like to support what we do as a show, we could always use your generous support over on Patreon, where you get all kinds of bonus content, ad-free episodes, early episodes, that sort of thing. And there's a group of people who do that already, and we really appreciate them. And that is Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle. And even if you didn't want to support us financially, but you wanted to be part of that awesome group, you can head over and join us for free and just be a part of the free version of that group. And that's fine too.
Yeah.
We do specifically want to acknowledge those who have been so generous with us and helped support what we're up to today.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you all so much. We love you.
Yes. In addition, of course, I need to thank everyone for listening today. And I really could not do this without my wonderful team of people writing and fact checking from Shane and myself. Audio engineering, producing, and just general goodness made happening by Justin, who is our audio tech guy, our editor, our wizard. And social media coordinating is done by Emma Wilson. Shane, is there anything else that you would like to add or anything that I'm missing before we transition to our recommendations?
No, I think that covers it on my end.
Great. If this is your first time here, I've said that sentence so many times, but we like to recommend some things. So surprise, this is a tag on the end of this. At the end of every discussion we have, we'll recommend something. It's usually like not directly related to the topic at hand, although it can be. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Shane, I'll let you go first.
Recommendations.
I'm going to recommend a publication called The Flow Trip. So The Flow Trip is a new magazine that has started coming out. Historically, it's been called, it was called Whalebone. And I know I've recommended Whalebone magazine before.
You have, yeah, I remember this.
So recently they came under new ownership. They changed kind of the format of the magazine, but I think it's still done really well. The first new magazine that's come out is about happiness. It's called the Happiness Edition. And for those of you who are like more science oriented, I think that you're going to have maybe a little bit of a hard time because it is a little bit hippie granola. It's very much so like it's got that kind of vibe that's a little crunchy, a little bit spirituality, like kind of like dig your feet into the sand and feel the power of the earth type of things, right? But I actually really enjoy reading that stuff because like and like completely like not even from a judgment standpoint, like I just am fascinated with like how people find peace.
Sure.
I like this edition of the magazine as it is, but I do also appreciate kind of the art direction of it. So it's like a really well curated, really beautifully designed magazine. Very few ads, a lot of really cool articles. There's an article in this one about surfers with disabilities, like limb differences. There is an article about mycology.
Ooh.
So there's some cool stuff inside of it that's like worth reading about. Like some cool interviews with people that do it, like are like, because one of the questions they ask a bunch of people is, what is happiness to you? And like their interpretations of happiness and whatnot. There's some recipes in there that are really cool about like my favorite quote in it says that you may not be happy before you have a cookie. And a cookie may not solve your problem with happiness after you've eaten the cookie. So like you may still have the problems that exist, but nobody is miserable while they're eating a cookie. And then it gives you kind of a chocolate chip cookie recipe. So and it's fun, it's light, it's not a heavy read, it gives you some activities and it's well curated and I think it's worth checking out.
All right, fair enough. For those looking for a sort of a crunchy granola read, or at least are happy with those reads.
Yeah, I mean they do all kinds of stuff. Like I mean the Whalebone would do like the pizza edition and the photo edition, and like they have like every magazine has its own theme, and so in the entire all of the content, all of the pictures, everything is centered around that theme, which is cool.
Got you.
Yeah.
Right now, I am living in the midst of a place that is experiencing some of the extreme heat. Not as extreme as other parts of the country, so I understand that it's a lot worse in other places than where I am. But it has been over 100 degrees for more than a week, and it is just quite toasty. Unfortunately, our AC is very old and really struggles to keep up with the temperature. And we actually had a tech come out and said that it was only pushing about 50% of what it was supposed to be able to push because there was something wrong with it. So we're probably going to have to replace it. But in the meantime, we went out and bought this little portable air conditioning unit to just try and help alleviate the amount of work that our AC was doing. We picked up this Toshiba portable air conditioner, and this thing was a game changer. I was extremely impressed. It is on the pricier end, but they had several models, and it really depended on the square footage you needed to fill.
Yeah.
We needed one that had a pretty decent amount of square footage, and so we got this, I don't know what it's called exactly, 14,000 BTU A-Shray. Well, there's a link in the notes anyway. So it is a Toshiba portable air conditioning unit. That thing really hauls its weight. I am incredibly impressed. It's one that you hook a hose up to the window for sort of the exhaust, the intake and the exhaust. But wow, does this thing, if it is incredibly effective. I've just been really impressed. So if you need one and you can afford it, I think Toshiba makes a very good portable AC.
I like it. I support it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we've already given our credits. We've already said our thanks. So unless there's anything that I'm forgetting, I think we can close this one out. So, what I will say that I did forget is that if you would like to talk to us about universal basic income or air conditioners or magazines, I guess, you can reach out to us directly by emailing us at info@wwd.podcast.com or on any of the regular social media platforms. And we'll be happy to discuss with you there. So feel free to contact us. We like to hear your thoughts, and we even will read listener mails sometimes when we get some good juicy ones. So send them our way. We like hearing from you.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, so with that, I can finally close this. That's all that I have to say. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
Catch us next week, but for now, we are out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.